It is our second webinar with our colleagues from the University of Lille, whom we are very glad to welcome as well. Hélène Lecoursois is connecting right now. And it is also this webinar tonight marks the completion of our cycle on the rights of nature, and for that we have the immense pleasure and honor of welcoming Professor Michael Cronin, who is Professor of French, Senior Researcher, 1776 Professor of French, and Senior Researcher in the Trinity Center for Literature and Cultural Translation. He has taught in several universities all over the world: Canada, Belgium, Peru, France, Egypt. And I didn't know that you're an officier des palmes académiques,
Yeah.
Professor Cronin, which means that you're a great friend of France. So it's a real pleasure. And you're also the author of 13 monographs uh, covering various fields such as translation studies, environmental studies, for instance, Translation in the Digital Age, 2013, Echo Translation, Translation Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene. Uh, and your research interests extend to areas such as eco-criticism and biocultural diversity. And as I said, it's really a great pleasure to have you as the special guest author and writer for tonight's seminar on the rights of nature. And so I'll hand over to you, Michael, and we'll be listening to you with immense pleasure. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Carle, for that very, very kind introduction. Merci à tout le monde de cette invitation. Je suis ravi de retrouver, je reconnais certains noms qui paraissent sur à l'écran. Donc, c'est vraiment un plaisir renouvelé pour moi de pouvoir vous parler. So, what I want to do this evening is to think about this notion of the rights of nature in the context of a project that I'm working on at present, which is it's a volume that's due to come out next year with the Royal Irish Academy, and its working title is Ireland: Why It Matters to Be an Island, which basically looks at the question of how my compatriots have sort of strangely neglected the islandness of the island. When we talk about islands in Ireland, it often tends to be in terms of the offshore islands, the Aran Islands, the Blaskets, and so on. But there is a certain kind of mainland envy that tends to inhabit the island itself, where there's a general kind of neglect or a kind of taboo about evoking the island-bound nature of the island itself. That when we talk about the island of Ireland, it's often in terms of a kind of political project, largely to do with the territorial unification of the island. But there's much less talk about what I would call ecological sovereignty, which is about thinking about or considering the sort of the geophysical integrity of the island, and how that Irish identities, which have often been constructed in terrestrial terms. A recent book by an Irish historian has the very evocative title, "The Land is All That Matters." Well, that's not true. We're surrounded on all sides by water, and that water and sea are constituent elements of what I would argue is the sort of the amphibious future of the island, and we need to think, I think, more deeply about the notion of amphibious identities in terms of the climate emergency. So, to some extent, in talking about the rights of nature, this afternoon, I want to kind of consider or think about that in terms of the larger question of islandness itself, and what are the kind of not just the ecological but the cultural implications of what that might mean. So I'm not going to do the thing that always fills me with fear and trembling, which is to share my slides. And I think we may be in luck. Yes, here are. Right. So the kind of the working title then that I've given the talk this evening is the rights of nature and island identities. So this is very much the kind of the theme I'll be trying to follow in tonight's talk. I want to begin firstly by looking at the notion of the rights of nature itself. And I want to, there's another sort of context perhaps I should specify here, is that in this book project that I've mentioned, there's sort of three parts to it. The first part is to do with what are the things that have inhibited a proper appreciation, a proper taking into account of the islandness of Ireland, the kind of the anthropological, the geographical, the historical, the technological reasons. The second part is basically looking at what are the consequences for contemporary politics and society in Ireland of the failure to fully appreciate or incorporate a notion of islandness. So got kind of past, present, and the kind of third part of future section is thinking about reimagining or rethinking this notion of island utopias, islands as utopian spaces, as spaces of futurity of particular kinds. I'm wondering or asking the question as to how, when we think about island futures in the case of Ireland, what exactly we might mean by this. How do we reformulate or rethink certain utopian conceptions when looking at the island and its environmental or ecological futures? One dimension of this utopian aspiration was very concretely expressed in a motion that was adopted by Derry City and Strabane District Council in June 2021, which recognised the rights of nature. The notion that will be familiar to everyone taking part in this seminar, that ecosystems have legal rights just as humans do. So similar motions were adopted by Omagh District Council and Donegal County Council in the same period. So in the words of the motion that were adopted by the Fermanagh and Omagh District Council on the 5th of July 2021, the rights of nature can help us to inspire an innovative rethinking about how to create regenerative, not extractivist economies, while also making human and other living communities safer, stronger, and more resilient. So all three councils advocated for embedding the rights of nature as a keystone concept in the operational practices, planning processes, and long-term decision-making of local government. In 2022, the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss recommended a referendum to enable the Irish Constitution to recognise the rights of nature. And of the 99 members who took part in that assembly, 83 voted in favour of holding such a referendum, so an overwhelming majority. Behind the rights of nature movement is the biocentric or ecocentric shift in legal thinking, which recognizes that beings other than humans have intrinsic rights. To date, Western legal thinking has been profoundly shaped by the Judeo-Christian notion of human dominion over nature and the consequent colonial commodification of nature as property. As a result, legal frameworks have developed without questioning the fundamental pathologies of anthropocentric bids for control over and domination of nature, exclusive forms of ownership, and the privileging of private property. Although the legal system grants rights to inanimate objects such as trusts, corporations, municipalities, these same rights are denied to the more than human world. Peter Doran and Rachel Colleen point to the consequences of such a restricted view of rights-bearing subjects for environmental law. There is, they argue, an emergent acknowledgement of the limitations of conventional environmental law approaches as campaigners and advocates come to an understanding that it is the integrity of whole ecosystems together with socio-ecological systems of practice, culture, and knowledge that require respect and protection. In other words, isolated or fragmented successes in protecting strips of land or other natural features feed into a false incrementalist narrative, while the logic of ecocide continues to inform the big picture when it comes to our dominant ideologies and societal myths. So if one of the functions of a just legal system, as traditionally defined by human self-interest, is to protect the rights to life of citizens living in a community and to protect them from unwarranted physical harm, then a legal system that allows for the undermining or wanton destruction of the planetary support systems that keeps humans alive violates one of its core principles. It is the very narrowness of the definition of rights that no longer makes them fit for purpose. In the words of Doran and Colleen, fundamental human rights are predicated on wholesale protection for the integrity, flourishing of all legal systems. By 2022, the Rights of Nature movement had given rise to over 400 legal initiatives across 39 countries. In 2008, Ecuador introduced constitutional recognition for the rights of nature. In 2010, the Bolivian government adopted a law on the rights of Mother Earth. And in recent years, New Zealand has granted legal personality and rights to the Whanganui River, the Te Auroara former national park, and Mount Taranaki. By way of illustrating the kinds of rights protected under these initiatives, we can take the example of the Bolivian law, and we see these different rights listed here on the slide, and they're rights, of course, that will be familiar to a number of you who've been working in or thinking about this area. Though the legal effectiveness of the constitutional protections of legal guarantees can vary, particularly in the face of the robust defence of vested interests, economic dependence on natural resources, and deeply entrenched owner-centric modes of thinking, the movement towards, if you like, a recognition of the rights of nature is gaining momentum, as is also evidenced on the island of Ireland in the council motions that I've mentioned and the recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly. Central to the emergence of an Earth jurisprudence, which recognizes the more than human world as a subject rather than as an object of law, are more democratic systems of representation, systemic changes to our legal systems, and cultural transformations in our attitudes to property and place, all of which, if you like, are key elements in traditions of utopian thinking. The rights of nature movement on the island reflects in part a kind of resurrection of hope in a dark and difficult period for ecological recovery. Mark Fisher notes the utopian kind of charge of utopian thinking when if you like, the charge of this thinking when prospects seem poor. He says the tiniest event can tear a hole in the great curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizon of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. One of the events that triggers a change in attitude is a retrieval of a sense of place. In their study of the motivational drivers for activists involved in the rights to nature movement on the island of Ireland, Rachel Killeen, Jeremy Gilbert, and Peter Doran quote a local council officer in Northern Ireland stating there is certainly a real sort of love of the place and heritage, which is obviously the natural heritage. And I suppose a real desire to want to protect that within people. So that protection of place is, I suppose, in a way, what we see very strong through the local activists. So if legal systems are one way of codifying human relations to place, then it is meaningful to ask how on the island that relationship has been conceptualized over time from a legal standpoint. Native jurisprudence on the island was encapsulated or incorporated in the Brehon laws in the pre-colonial period. The more than human world was integrated into the way that the indigenous lawmakers conceived of a well-ordained society. The 8th century Breha Comechasa, which you might translate as neighborhood judgments, contained a list of 28 trees and shrubs and the penalties which anyone who damaged them would incur. The 7th century Bec Brehe, the bee judgments, imposed a heavier fine for damage that was done to a tree during growing season, as any cut made was likely to lead to rotting or disease. The harming of sacred trees associated with important sites incurred still heavier penalties. The frame in which the legal system was situated was the ruler's Fir Flahaman, basically the kind of the judgment of the ruler, the sort of the guarantee of a prosperous, strife-free period. If the ruler was guilty of Gau Flahaman, injustice, then the soil and the elements will rebel against them, bringing, in the words of one document, crop failure, dearth of fish, defeat in battle, plagues, lightning, and so on. So wise government of the land encapsulated in this notion of Fear-Flahaman implied a respectful dwelling and an attentiveness to the balance of rights and regard across the communities of species on the island. Recasting this notion, this indigenous notion of Fear-Flahaman, in contemporary human rights discourse involves understanding that the rights of nature and the rights of humans are indivisible. In a document submitted by Rights of Nature in Ireland to the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, the authors argued that, and I quote, "The human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment must be embedded and rendered meaningful through acknowledgement of nature's own intrinsic right to health, to thrive, regenerate, and flourish independently of human purposes." In July 2022, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a universal human right. Critically, the members of the UN Assembly added that, and I quote, "The impact of climate change, the unsustainable management and use of natural resources, the pollution of air, land, and water, the unsound management of chemicals and waste, and the resulting loss in biodiversity interfere with the enjoyment of that right." So in other words, this human right is utterly meaningless if nature is denied its own intrinsic rights. The latter rights must be respected if the human right is to have any chance of becoming a reality. The rebellion of the natural world has already begun in the extreme weather events that are becoming more common on the island, and they point to the Gau-Flahaman, the injustice of systems of land use and cultures of growth and economic behaviour, which show scant regard for the overall health of our ecosystem. The University of Limerick academic and thinker Tom Moylan, in his recent book, Becoming Utopian, The Culture and Politics of Radical Transformation, has argued that another important element in the utopian method is memory. That is a memory that is productive rather than consoling or disempowering. The reactivation of the Brehon Law tradition and cosmology in the contemporary rights of nature movement on the island is evidence of this deployment of memory as a constituent part of a utopian project. Memory on the island, as will be familiar to all of you who work in Irish studies, can often become a hostage to a sense of recrimination or an endless recital of historical wrongs. The exercise may be consoling, but it is not always very productive. Equally, parading a history of past environmental failures can lead to a feeling, however understandable it may be, of dystopian paralysis and disempowerment. When Colleen, Gilbert and Doran observe that the rights of nature movements appear to have been most successful where they've been picked up by strong indigenous social movements, they point, if you like, to the potency of indigenous worldviews and beliefs in motivating environmental resistance. Retrieving indigenous belief systems or methods of social organization on the island, such as the Brehon Law tradition, not only contributes to shaping our ability to reimagine a different relationship with the more than human world, it also becomes a powerful source of identification because it relates to the very place that activists seek to protect. Vincent Gagan has argued that what is needed in late modernity is the form of memory which the great utopian thinker Ernst Bloch referred to as anagnorisis or recognition, because it is through recognition that memory traces are reactivated in the present as a repository of experience and value. By dint of different historical experiences, memory traces on the island are plural, and it is this plurality that needs to become an important rallying point for cultivating an island awareness. Killeen, Gilbert, and Doran, for example, point to the difficulties associated with promoting forms of indigeneity that are based on the notion of, and I quote them, an idealized rural Gaelic-speaking community, and that risk reducing everybody outside of that imagined community of indigenes to, and I quote, a colonizer or a colonial puppet. It is in this context that I want to emphasize how the contributions of all of the island's communities need to be factored into a viable notion of ecological sovereignty. Sean, the poet, writer, critic, Sean Lycett, in discussing the history of plant names in Ireland, in John Wilson Foster's book, Nature in Ireland, looks at the restrictive definitions of Irish heritage in the past, which tended to exclude natural history. This was partly because, and I quote, natural history in the form of field clubs and scientific associations had traditionally been the preserve of the Protestant gentry and professional middle class. And he goes on to argue that the, and I quote, institutions, the personnel and the terminology of natural history were all thoroughly implicated in the phase of constructive unionism that lasted from 1890 to the First World War. What characterized the work of many of these natural historians was an intense interest in local place and a desire to map out the specificity and establish the uniqueness of the flora and fauna to be found all over the island. The Linnaean scientific method allowed the naturalists to explore, identify, and name thousands of life forms that would have been unknown in either of the island's major vernaculars, because human language, of course, tends to concentrate on particular categories of birds, animals, or plants with which humans have constant interaction. The activities of these naturalists helped establish both the distinctiveness of the island, but also its connectedness to global environmental patterns elsewhere. In her study of William Thompson's multi-volume natural history of Ireland, so Thomas is a Belfast naturalist who produced these volumes between 1849 and 1856. Mary Orr pays particular attention to the fifth volume of Thompson's natural history, which is on the fishes of Lough Neagh and Lough Geneva. And of course, this has got a particularly kind of sad resonance in the present moment with the catastrophic pollution and the destruction of the organic life of Lough Neagh. At any rate, in the fifth volume of Thompson's work, we find this study of the fishes of Lough Neagh and Lough Geneva. Or in her work, her kind of main preoccupation is with the foreign reception of Irish natural history, which in many ways she saw as becoming a kind of prisoner of its country of origin. The difficulty in Thompson's time, of course, was that Ireland was part of a larger political entity, and that as a result, it would find its contributions to scientific knowledge were deemed to be additive, supplementary, subordinate in various ways. At the worst, it was a mere footnote. At best, it was part of a much bigger, but bigger in the sense of these two islands, that picture. Orr argues Ireland, as the smaller adjacent landmass of the British Isles, remained at best the lesser detachable knowledge domain, an adjunct or periphery of the Greater Britain of England, Scotland, and Wales. At worst, Ireland was ever the backwater, defying civilizing projects, including the scientific. Even when Ireland became an independent nation state, a member of the EU almost a century later, there was little concomitant shift in the 20th century critical mind regarding its independent or interdependent knowledge value. This, of course, was not how Thompson viewed his own work, or situates his writing on ichthyology and the study of fishes within a European, predominantly French language framework. The very decision, if you like, to compare an Irish lake and a continental European one, namely one in Switzerland, indicates that Thompson was thinking beyond the local circumstances of Ireland. His extensive travels in Europe in 1826 and 1827 were to prove formative in his scientific development. In particular, he developed a form of comparative thinking, which transcended the focus, if you like, on local curiosities within an imperial whole. So in reassessing Thompson's reputation, Orr is keen not to engage in a kind of an exercise of nationalist one-upmanship. Instead, she wants to abandon the kind of zero-sum game of nationalisms in order to establish wider affinities. And she does this by, if you like, trying to see Thompson's writing from the point of view or the framework in which he himself would have seen it. And she says the scientific authority of writer and work is unquestionably continental, international, and mainstream, because Thompson's quietly provocative comparative thrust for Ireland in the understanding of its natural history is always an informatively interconnective, interdependent, anti-nationalist endeavour. So crucially, if you like, the range and effectiveness of the broader comparative perspectives depends on an island-wide network of local informants whose contributions to the knowledge of Ireland's fishes are dutifully catalogued by Thompson. He has these kind of citizen scientists working all over the island who contribute information on the fish to be found in various parts of the island. So this, if you like, is a kind of bottom-up rather than top-down scientific cosmopolitanism, which anchors the field of natural history in a dialogue between the global and the local. Writing an article called The Irish Field Clubs in 1894, Robert Lloyd Prager, one of the great naturalists of the first half of the 20th century in Ireland, and who was a grandson of Robert Paddison, the man who edited the 5th volume of Thomson's Natural History after his death, noted so this is Prager in his article, he noted that the lack in Ireland of a general interest in natural history when compared with England or many parts of the continent. 4 working clubs over 31,000 square miles is certainly a very modest allowance. The indifference to natural history that's referenced by Prager was in no small part bound up with a kind of an opposition that's identified by Sean Lycett that I mentioned a few moments ago, where he says that English culture has given prominence to a sentimental, pastoral view of nature and countryside based on continuity, belonging, and fruition. Irish experience, on the other hand, has been marked by the opposites: discontinuity, exile, and sterility. So, reactivating memory traces can, of course, be a reminder of colonial trauma and can lead to a complicated or troubled relationship with place. But memory can also lead to transformation. So, if you like, in an attempt to work towards an island awareness, what would appear to be crucial is that the memory traces of all of our traditions, those of natural history, as much as those of the Dinseanchas, the indigenous place lore tradition, that these be brought to bear on place, so that points of and histories of identification are available to all island dwellers. No form of knowledge, if you like, can be privileged at the experience of another. And it is true, if you like, the convergence of different ways of knowing that the uniqueness and value of place becomes apparent. In his autobiographical work, The Way That I Went, Robert Lloyd Prager expressed his wish that the people on the island would pay due attention to the world that sustained them in so many different ways. He hoped that a person of ordinary intelligence would find as much to interest him in the ground he walks on, the air he breathes, the myriad lower creatures, large and small, which share the earth with him, as in the present activities of populist human highs, or in the memorials of bygone piety or warfare, which are everywhere with us. So, the sources of that interest that he talks about are multiple. In keeping, if you like, in keeping sort of faith with Bloch in the life-enhancing properties of recognition, we must bear in mind how different groups at different historical moments have interpreted their own ecological relationship with the shared earth of the island. Such awareness encourages a sense of collective environmental belonging that is not predicated on membership of any one political or religious tradition. As one interviewee in Colleen, Gilbert and Doran's study puts it, the air we breathe, and the water we drink, the land that we farm, affects everyone. So, in responding to a common threat to their continued existence and flourishing, each person on the island will draw on memories of different traditions of engaging with the more than human world. In 2024, the journal, an online publication here in Ireland, revealed that the number of houses, of Irish homes that were at risk of falling into the sea had risen by 173% over the previous 5 years. This figure, in fact, was believed to be a serious underestimate, as only half of the local authorities impacted by coastal erosion have been able to provide data. A Climate Action Regional Office study of Ireland's 19 coastal councils found a 58% increase in properties lost to the sea between 2017 and 2022. An internal Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications report from 2022 warned of, and I quote, the huge challenge currently facing coastal local authorities, which will only escalate into the future with the predicted increase and frequency in storm surges and sea level rise. Mary Burke, a geographer here in my own university in Dublin, Trinity College, has argued that the short-term solutions to the problem of coastal erosion are very, very expensive, and in the short run and in the long run, largely ineffective. She says, or she argues, that rather than trying to fix or engineer the landscape, the government needs to implement a managed retreat of Ireland's worst affected areas. She claimed, the reality is I don't think there is a lot that can be done, and I feel so sad for the people who live there and who invested there. My advice going forward in the future is do not buy property close to the coastline unless you're prepared to lose it, and maybe very, very quickly. Joan Hopkins, who is a local councillor in the Fingal area outside Dublin, has advocated for long-term thinking with respect to Ireland's coastlines, particularly with respect to construction. She says, I know we need homes, but there's no point in building on our floodplains. There's no point in building in coastal areas that are actively retreating. These need to be set aside. One of the things you can do is you can let nature do what it's going to do, and it has a way of balancing itself out, reaching an equilibrium. The figures on and the kind of reaction to coastal erosion are indicators of the inconvenient truth of Ireland's islandness and the mounting pressures of climate change linked to global warming. They reveal not only the extent to which the interaction between land and sea is rapidly changing on the island, but also the need for a societal response. Central to how this response might be framed is how islands are often cast in climate conversations. Carle Forbotko, examining media depictions of how islands are depicted in climate crisis sort of media reports, talks in particular about the Pacific island of Tuvalu. Many of you are probably aware of the pictures of Tuvalu, the images of the rising waters and the island kind of disappearing under these ocean waters. And she looks at these kind of media representations of this specific nation state, and she shows how legacy representations of island spaces often determine the way in which islanders themselves are shown as the kind of the luckless, the unfortunate victims in a global climate parable. One of the reasons, of course, that both physical and global and social scientists have been so attracted to islands over the centuries is the promise of closure and control, the founding conditions of the scientific experiment and the touchstone of empirical positivism. Françoise Perron writes about the lure of the island. The island, with its hard, clear outline engraved on the hazy surface of the sea, seems to incarnate an isolated and self-sufficient world. It can thus appear as a form of the world that is complete in itself. There is consequently something reassuring about it. It permits an illusion that reality may be experienced in its entirety. So the island, if you like, becomes a kind of knowledge utopia where the idealized, closed, isolated island is not only an enclosed world complete in itself, but also a source of complete, perfect knowledge. As Fabotko argues, the island laboratory has thus been a space, has thus long been a space on which to inscribe desires for a small, perhaps even utopian world that is more tangible, more graspable, and more understandable than large, complex mainlands, continents, or planet Earth. The dream of the controlled experiment becomes the idea that island experience can be scaled up to account for physical and social phenomena at a global level. It is in this positivist spirit that Margaret Mead on the islands of Samoa feels permitted to use specific island societies as models for more general theories of human society and sexual mores. It could be argued that part of the fascination with, for example, Irish-speaking offshore islands was the way that they could be scaled, could be seen as a kind of scaled back version of an Irish-speaking island, a kind of a vision in petto of a Gaelic utopia. This perception would be based on the assumption that Ireland was the mainland, since in Fabotko's words, continents or mainlands are the standard by which islands are judged. Ironically, part of the thinking behind the movement towards political autonomy on the island was the desire not to be defined anymore as an island with respect to the British mainland. It could equally be argued that a motivating factor behind the Brexit vote was an unhappiness about Britain becoming a mere island off the European continent rather than a mainland at the heart of an erstwhile empire. The recurring theme, if you like, in this kind of endless set of reconfigurations and configurations is that, in Fabotko's words, unequal relationships are imagined in the dramatizations and divisions of distance and difference that project inferior islands in opposition to superior continents or or mainlands, which of course, I think I would argue, often means that islands themselves can become victims of this mainland envy. Um, it's, it is in the context then of coastal erosion, storm surges, and rising sea levels that the island of Ireland needs to avoid the eco-colonial gaze of what Fabocco calls wishful sinking. This is the idea that islands become the repositories of continental fears and anxieties and are seen as the helpless and hapless victims of events that become climate bellwethers, climate warning systems for the rest of the planet. Deprived of agency, islanders are left only with the escape route of migration as their photogenic homes are consigned to climate oblivion. Avoiding the trap of the mainland gaze does not mean embracing the equally or problematic fiction of disowning or disavowing islandness and assuming a kind of continental condescension. Islandness needs to be embraced as an active principle of intervention and not as a passive marker of incapacity. Taking seriously the threats to the geophysical integrity of the island and sustainability of island futures does not mean having to indulge in the problematic moral geography of wishful thinking. Rather, what I would argue it implies is finding the necessary global and local leverage to restore a sense of meaningful agency to the island population. So I think I'll probably finish up there with the sort of the more formal part of the this evening's seminar. Maybe just to say sort of one kind of concluding remark. And this is something that relates to one of the very last essays that Gilles Deleuze wrote, L'île déserte, where he talks about one of the things that haunts island populations, he argues, is a fundamental ontological instability. And this is basically the idea that, so islands are these pieces of land that either break off larger continental land masses, in this case with Britain and Ireland, or else there's a volcanic eruption and you get this kind of sui generis creation of the island. But in either case, there is always a kind of uneasy alliance between land and sea. There's the kind of the notion that the land at any moment can, if you like, disappear under the waves, disappear under the sea. And one of the Deleuze would argue, one of the kind of the ontological challenges for islanders is how to deal with this sense of precariousness. And one of them, one of the ways of dealing with this sense of ontological sort of précarité is disavowal, is to become completely invested in the terrestrial, is to ignore, if you like, that sense of sort of a maritime boundedness. You know, in the words of that recent history book, The Land That Is All That Matters, you become kind of overly invested in that terrestrial space. So I think one of the things that I would argue that has happened with the climate emergency is that it has led to a kind of challenging of that particular ontological taboo for the Irish. But I stop there, and of course, would very much welcome any questions or comments. Si il y a des gens qui se sentiraient plus à l'aise pour poser des questions en français, je serais tout à fait heureux de prendre nos questions ou commentaires en français si les gens le désirent.
Well, thank you very, very much for this far-reaching, presentation. This reflection about the sovereignty of the island in general, and of Ireland as an island in particular. And I'm sure there are many questions. I mean, you've covered so much ground. I mean, I don't know if ground is the right word, but you've covered so much material that we're very grateful to you. I'm sure there are a lot of questions awaiting you. Perhaps I would have one to begin with, and so as to give time for the others to prepare theirs. I was absolutely fascinated by what you said about the role of natural history. Everything you said about the role of natural history, especially in the 19th century, I think is very, very convincing and very new, very interesting. So thank you very much for this in particular, but there are so many other aspects of your presentation which are extremely interesting. But this one in particular was great interest to me. And I particularly liked what you said about the fact that, if I understood correctly, different groups may have different interpretations of their environment at different times in history, hence the role of natural history in the 19th century, if that's what you said, Michael. And I was wondering whether this would entail that there are different definitions of sovereignty, because if the representation of the island is not exactly the same, and if natural history becomes an aid in trying to define the environment and to have a specifically historically determined representation of your environment, does that mean that you would argue for different conceptions of sovereignty at different times?
Yes, no, thank you for that question, Carl. It's an excellent question. I think yes. I mean, it seems to me that it depends very much on how it defines this notion of sovereignty, because you can have exclusive notions of sovereignty, which by definition want to exclude others in order to establish a particular idea of sovereignty. But there are also, I think, inclusive forms of sovereignty. I mean, I suppose to some extent, what I'm trying to get at here is the sense in which, so much of the discussions around sovereignty in Ireland have very much been caught up with the notion of territorial sovereignty. Who has ownership over territory on the island? I mean, this is, when people talk about sovereignty territory, it's very much within that framework. But it occurred to me over the years that there wasn't much point in claiming ownership over land that was no longer there. That if you have a kind of an island that's gradually being eroded because of particular forms of economic or ecological behavior, then that kind of notion of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, became increasingly problematic, and that really the notion of sovereignty, think about, was ecological sovereignty, where you look to maintain the geophysical integrity of the island, so all of the communities on the island can enjoy, if you like, the prospect of dwelling on those in that territory. But in order for that to happen, it seems to me, one has to think about the elements that you're going to bring to that notion of ecological sovereignty, and that's why I was particularly kind of interested in how we mobilize those different traditions on the island, the indigenous Dinshamagus tradition, and how it construes or conceives of space and the relationship to the more than human world. And then the natural history tradition, which was very much associated with one particular community at a particular moment, and how the histories of that tradition be brought to bear too in constructing this kind of notion of an ecological sovereignty. But
Thank you
thank you.
very much. Well,
Yeah.
very rich answer too. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have questions. There's one from Moraid, I think, if I can see correctly. Can't see you very well, but I think it's you. You're muted.
Right. Film to licht an.
Sorry, my mouse was playing tricks. Gur míle mágat a sin a bhíl. I was just thinking aloud in a way, if I think of Ireland as an island community, it is very much about the community of islanders rather than individual islanders. And then if I think about the Ireland of the Brehon laws, again, there was this interconnectedness between the human and the other than human world. And I think the concept of Dúchas kind of enshrines that interconnectivity. And it's a worldview as well that I associate with Indigenous peoples. And then when I think about rights, it's a very different kind of world I'm thinking about. It's the rights of the individual. Human rights are very often at the level of the individual. One is entitled to whatever it is. And I'm wondering when it comes to nature rights, and one is thinking about a river or whatever, is there any tension between the collective and in the individual? Is there any clash of mentalities going on there? It's just something I'm thinking aloud as you're talking.
No, I think that's an absolutely crucial question, Mairead, and it's something that, I mean, you're probably familiar with some of the debates around this, but it really goes to the heart of a lot of contemporary debates about eco-jurisprudence, to what extent, part of the problem is the very notion of rights itself, which tend to be invested, in particularly around the notion of property and possession and individual, and then the emergence of private property and rights and democratic systems and so on. So I think that's absolutely true. But I think that's all the more reason why we need to bring in these different forms of thinking in order to kind of redefine how we conceive of or what we think about rights. So that, in other words, I don't think that rights arguments or rights discourse can incorporate these other and different traditions without themselves being changed by this particular process as we do this, So that's why I see this as very much a kind of an evolving process. So it's not so much the kind of the accordance of these rights as an end point, but rather that this is triggering off a particular set of debates around what constitutes rights, or what more collective notions of rights might entail. But that is absolutely a very, very live issue. Yeah.
Are there further questions from the audience? I'm sure there are plenty. Yes, Hélène?
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this talk and for all the ideas. It's taking me a long time to process everything. So it's not really a question, but it's maybe a comment, or I would like your opinion on, because you mentioned this, it's towards the end of your talk, when you mentioned an island as the fantasy of an island seen as a complete world, and a dream of this completeness, and where experiments can be conducted. have you, and I'm sure you have, but what if we think with glissant and his archipelagic metaphor of the island precisely as incomplete, but in relation with other islands? Does that apply to an Irish islandness?
Yes, thanks again for that yeah, common question. Absolutely. I mean, one of the key books in kind of that I used in sort of working on this book was this Poétique la relation. So where Glissant precisely thinks about this notion of relation and the kind of archipelagic thinking, you know, that as you know, as a way of configuring islandness in a particular way. And one of the ways, I mean, just to kind of illustrate part of my thinking on this is I've often been intrigued by the ways in which peripherality often becomes a constituent part of Irish identity formation, often something that's projected on it from elsewhere. I mean, there's the famous letter that the papal librarian Anastasius sent to the theologian philosopher Erugena in the 9th century, where he was sort of complimenting, Erugena on his translation of the Neoplatonic writings of Dionysius the Areopagite. He says how extraordinary it is. He says that this barbarian who lives in what he called Finis Terrae, so the Finisterre, the ends of the earth, should be able to produce this very deft translation from Greek to Latin. He's very kind of, he wants to know where Erugena gets his Greek from, you know. So, but it's the depiction of the island as kind of Finis Terrae, so this notion of the island at the edge of the continent. I just recently gave a lecture on one of Sylvain Tesson's latest works, Les Faits, which, you know, he travels from the coast of northwestern Spain up around the coast of Ireland and around the coast of Scotland, and it's saturated with the notion of peripherality, of the kind of this place that's out on the edge of Europe, and that's very much that notion of kind of the edge is frequently depicted as this kind of an isolated island fortress out there on the edge of Europe. But if you actually look at how the country has evolved over time, and this is the very first monograph that I wrote almost 30 years ago now, translating Ireland, where one of the things that I wanted to show was that so many of the key moments of kind of political and cultural change in the island have been triggered by these contexts that had come from elsewhere, and when you look at it, and this requires a certain exercise of the geographical imagination, is where Ireland finds itself. It actually finds itself on kind of a crossroads from northern influences coming down from Scandinavia and the Scandinavian world, which are then meeting influences which are coming up from the Iberian Peninsula, sort of so pushing up, if you like, northwards towards Ireland. Then we have this kind of push that's coming from Central Europe across Western Europe to the island of Ireland, and then continuing on to the Americas. So what I kind of, one of the arguments I make, and sort of inspired in part by Glissant's Poétique la relation, is that Ireland finds itself not so much in a peripheral paradigm, but in a quadrivial paradigm, this crossroads paradigm, which I find much more enabling and much more interesting than the peripheral paradigm, which is often, and it's interesting because you see how that has become internalized in Ireland itself, in so much of the kind of the tourist iconography of the island, this latest kind of tourist fetish, the wild Atlantic way. It's feeding off the kind of the exoticization of peripherality. But the actual economic, cultural, and social reality of the island for centuries, not millennia, has been this its situation on this kind of quadrivial on these quadrivial axes, and that seems to me to be much more enabling and something that certainly draws on that kind of that notion of archipelagic connectedness and relation that Glissant talks about.
Thank you very much. I'm
Thank
sure there
you.
are other questions. I have another one, Michael, while waiting for I'm sure others. This at some point you mentioned Margaret Mead, and I would be tempted to link this. I mean, and the whole question of the development of ethnology in the early 20th century, that ability to cast gaze at islands from a distance and taking part, observing participation at the same time, you know, this dichotomy between being part of and standing at a distance from islands, which was so defining of the anthropological moment in the early 20th century. And it seems to me that there are writers in Ireland who have the capacity to play with the motif of the island as a kind of island within the island, who are able to write so as to cast a kind of anthropological gaze at Ireland as if they were looking at it from a distance while they are part of it. And, you know, I'm thinking, for instance, of Swift. When you think of Gulliver's Travels, it's very much a novel about, you know, being in Ireland and looking at Ireland as if it were something totally different, something distant Ireland. Or Beckett. Beckett has written many, many works where Ireland is very much an island within the island. And would you think that's part and parcel of the Irish tradition of literature? I would argue that it is, but I'd like to have your views on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very interesting observation, and I think it's partly bound up with something that there's a wonderful book many years ago that Jean-Claude Guibault wrote, Voyage en Océanie. So he's basically traveling around Polynesia, and he begins to kind of notice something on these travels, which is that he argues that one of the things that strikes him about the islanders that he meets is that on the one hand, they're kind of completely obsessed with the islands. They keep talking about it. They know every sort of kind of centimeter, every meter of the island. They're deeply proud of its traditions, places, and so on. And he's very struck by that sense of island connection and island pride. The other thing that he's struck by is that they can't get off these islands quick enough. They cannot get off the island soon enough. And so so it's this kind of island ambivalence, or this kind of that he notes in island peoples, and the kind of image that he uses to capture this is the tree and the dugout canoe. So the tree is this thing that's kind of very rooted to the spot, is absolutely part of the ecosystem. It actually depends on its rootedness in a particular place. It is of that place and in that place. But this is also the tree that, when it gets cut down and is hollowed out, allows one to travel great distances. And we know, of course, that the Polynesians were extraordinary navigators with their indigenous navigational systems. There are certain tales from Irish mythology that talk about the same thing, about the tree being cut down, which is then turned into a vehicle that allows one to go away. So I think one of the reasons why you're getting that kind of dual um, sort of tension in islanders, writing about the island as both part of and at a great distance from, is that in their kind of life praxis, whether it's the Polynesians or the Irish or the Icelanders, that there is this same thing about that the island is both kind of a utopian space of possibility and a prison house of the soul, where you're surrounded on all sides by the waters of your island prison. So there's that kind of deep ambivalence, which produces, as you quite rightly point out, that kind of binocular or bifocal perspective. And Beckett is it's a beautiful exemplification of that. Where he talks about the eel as this kind of space that he's kind of forever he's tramping around, that he needs to get away from. But of course, when he gets away from it, he's constantly drawn back to that space. Which is beautifully illustrated in that book by Owen O'Brien, Beckett's Country. Where that kind of the Beckettian topography is largely mapped on these spaces that Beckett had to leave. So thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you, Michael. I think Marion has a question.
Yes, well, I have two questions. Thank you very much, Michael, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I would like, if possible, you to come back to what you said about at the beginning of your talk about the native jurisprudence going back to the Brehon laws. I found that absolutely fascinating. And I was interested, in fact, in the kind of punishments, because you talked of the nature kind of, defending itself and fending for itself, and about the Besh-Bereha and the damage to the trees. And I mean, apart from nature's response, what would be the legal punishments that would have been applied if someone committed, that kind of crime? I was thinking, of the recent case of the sycamore tree in Britain, that was felled in 2023, and there was much uproar, about the sycamore gap tree, and so I mean, they went to prison actually, I think, or they had to pay a fine or whatever. But what would have been done at that time,
Yeah, it was largely it was a fine of some kind that somebody would have to pay, usually in the form of material of goods to the person, or more the kind of the community that actually sort of possessed the particular either or who dwelled in that particular place. But there are also instances of active restoration where somebody would have to replant the trees or the shrubs or the it could take different forms. It could either take a material form or it could take a non-material form. So it was a kind of sort of a low-level restorative ecology, through that system of jurisprudence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I was also wondering, you mentioned Sean Lysart, whom I happen to know very well, and I really appreciate his work. And it's interesting because I think he's in between, he's both a poet, but also kind of naturalist in his own way. And I mean, he's actually compiling every day. On his Facebook page, he just uploads a page of the Deneen dictionary, with a word in Irish describing, a particular feature of the landscape or something. And I was wondering if, we could find some kind of new naturalists or in Ireland, in well, not only in this scientific kind of academic world, but also in poetry, for instance. So I was thinking of Sean Lysart, but also Dara McAnulty, who wrote this brilliant book, The Diary of a Young Naturalist, who, I mean, in his own way, he's doing the same. So I was wondering if you had something to share about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important. The kind of work that's you mentioned, Sean Lys's work, McNulty, the late and very, very much lamented Manchán Magan,
Yeah, I was thinking of this.
his particular works. One of the reasons I think it's really, really important to mention or to talk or think about the contribution of writers and poets and sort of cultural commentators to this debate is that there's a very, very serious problem in ecological debate. I think not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, which is the complete domination of a lot of environmental policy, a lot of environmental discussion by kind of STEM hegemony. The notion that ecological debates or our environmental future will be adjudicated by techno fixes. If I look at the various climate centres that have been set up on the island, they are almost exclusively in the science area, science, engineering, and technology. They get the very, very large grants. There's very significant sums of money, personnel resources are devoted to this. And it's very much in the idea of finding the kind of the silver techno bullet solution to environmental problems. Whereas what we know about the environmental crisis is that it is at heart, it's an anthropological problem. It's about how people make sense of the way that they live their lives, how we attribute meaning to the things that we do, how growth or the notion of growth is basically one of the most powerful theologies that the world has ever experienced in its kind of magical force. So if there is to be a kind of an anthropological undoing, the way that that's got to come about is through narrative. It's how people narrate the significant structures and meanings of their lives and attribute meaning to the things that they do. Where if we're going to look at a kind of alternative ways of looking or conceiving or thinking about the modern human world and our place in the modern human world, we've got to look at people who have imagined that and are imagining it differently. This is not to be found in the STEM, it's to be found in the humanities. The humanities in Ireland has the lowest rate of funding in the entire 27 European Union. It's 4% of research funding. And that 4% is an increase from 3% over a 10-year period. So something that is absolutely central to a sustainable, resilient environmental future for the island, which is the area and the work in humanities, is the one that is least regarded, least financed, and the most peripheralized in the kind of the educational ecology of the island itself. So I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that this is the idea that you can somehow impose techno fixes on populations without the populations themselves, embracing or change or adaptation, which they need to do in terms of their that they are historical subjects, right? They are people who live in time, who have a past, who have a history, and that has given them particular values, particular outlets, and so on. If you don't take that into account, then any form of environmental policy strikes me as an absolutely doomed project, a spectacular waste of public money, and something that, I think in the humanities we kind of need to be more vocal about just how important they are. I mean, this little book that I wrote in 2019, Irish and Ecology on Gaelgeachs na Chomhaíocht, I was just, it was written, it's the fastest written book. I wrote it in 3 weeks in a fit of rage. There was something kind of Swiftian about the composition, because there was a climate action plan, which was the first climate action plan the government had ever produced. And it ran to 138 pages. There was thousands and thousands of words. There wasn't a single word in the entire document about the Irish language. So this is a language that has described every field, every tree, every corner, every hill, every lake, every river and tributary on the island for more than 2,000 years. And it was nowhere to be seen in a document that was allegedly talking about the environmental integrity of the island of Ireland. So it's this kind of breathtaking blindness is something that I really feel needs to be kind of redressed in various ways. But I think that that's happening, and you can see it. I mean, in the kind of the reaction to Manchán Magan's passing, a real sense of popular grief, because he touched on something that was very important, the kinds of things that Sean is touching on, and Dara in his work, Moya Cannon, there's just so many other writers where that is very much. In fact, there's somebody I did want to mention, which is the book, the Colony, book by Hopkins, where she again talks about it, and like Audrey Hopkins, about this island off the coast of Ireland. Again, it's interesting, and this kind of metonymic displacement, kind of using the offshore island to think about the larger island. But she does talk about language shift and language lost. But it's a Frenchman, a man called Masson, the linguist, who is most preoccupied about this, or by this question of linguistic shift and the relationship to the environment. Sorry, Marion, that was a very long-winded answer to your very good, very good question.
Thank you so much, Michael. Do you have other questions, or in the chat, or?
Well, if there aren't, we're going to thank you again, Michael, very, very warmly for beautiful contribution, and putting a brilliant end to a cycle of webinars on the rights of nature. It is our intention, as we said in an earlier email, to set up a publication in which we hope your contribution will feature, and will feature, we will give in pride of place. But thank you very, very much, and we look forward to being in touch again. As I keep saying, perhaps we can do something for the humanities, since there's going to be the Irish presidency of the Council of the EU. It's time to ask for more. Perhaps. Let's hope for the best. Anyway, I wish everyone a nice evening, and we thank you again, Michael, and see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.
Slán.
Thank you.
You
Bye.
are.